Hello Daily Drafters and welcome back to another video in my how-to series entitled How to Build Complicated Mana Bases. I get questions like this relatively often in my set review videos and live streams asking me exactly how to build a mana base for a limited deck that contains more than 2 colors. It's not a simple task, but in this video I will do my best to make sure it is as accessible a goal as possible so that you will feel confident enough to build multicolor mana bases in your next draft. Let's dive in. When you draft a Magic the Gathering deck, the majority of the time I'd say you end up in a 2-color pair combination with roughly half of your cards in one of the colors and half of your cards in the other color. When we build a mana base for this particular example, it is customary to add 9 basic lands of one of your colors and 8 basic lands of your other color, totaling 17 lands. This is level 0 of understanding limited mana bases, and I'll assume everyone watching this video already has at least this level of basic understanding. But what happens if you really want to fit in at least one card of a third color because it's super powerful and you just can't leave it in your sideboard? Well, we call this splashing in Limited because, while it's not exactly one of your main colors, you're just, well, splashing that extra color. How can we do this responsibly without ruining the integrity of our mana base? Well, it comes down to how many mana sources you have in your deck and what exactly you're trying to splash. Before we dive into the statistics, we must also understand exactly what a source is when building a mana base. A source can be defined as any card in your deck that can produce the particular color of mana that you're looking for, or find a card that can. If you're looking to add a white source to your blue-red deck, the easiest way to do that would be to remove one of your blue or red basic lands and add a plains, therefore giving you one white source to help you cast your white cards. What other sorts of things can act as sources? Dual lands that produce white also count as a source, as they can help you cast your white cards. Artifacts like Manalith that tap for 1 mana of any color can be counted as a source. Utility lands like Evolving Wilds and Crystal Grotto also count as sources, as they can either produce or find other white sources. Some creatures like Birds of Paradise and Ornithopter of Paradise can count as sources because they can produce mana of any color. Some ramp spells like Rampant Growth and Thunderherd Migration can count as sources, as they can fetch any color of mana from your deck. When counting sources in your deck, simply count the number of cards that produce or can find cards that produce your required colors of mana. Now let's dive into the weeds on how to splash. Let's say you've opened a sealed pool and you have decided to build a straightforward blue-red deck, but you just absolutely have to include that Elesh Norn Mother of Machines because you just know she will be one of the absolute best cards in your deck. How do you do that exactly? Well, if you weren't playing the Elesh Norn, you would probably be running 8 islands and 9 mountains in your deck. With this extremely standard limited mana base, you will have a 95% chance to find a mountain by turn 4 if you're on the play, a 92% chance to find an island, and an 87% chance to find at least one of each. And I will also be using turn 4 on the play for all of these examples just for continuity and ease of understanding. If you decide to remove a mountain and put a plains in its place, you would then have 8 islands, 8 mountains, and 1 plains in your deck, or 8, 8, and 1 sources. In this scenario, you have a 92% chance to find a mountain, 92% chance to find an island, and an 85% chance to find at least one of each, and a 25% chance you'll find your 1 plains in your deck. Notice how by removing the 1 mountain, you lost a little bit of consistency with your mana base already. With this setup, there is also a 21% chance you will find at least one of all 3 of your colors by turn 4 on the play. Not exactly a percentage that most Magic players would consider to be particularly great. So what happens if you were to up the number of basic plains you put in your deck at the expense of either mountains or islands? Take a look at the updated percentages. Not until you add 3 basic plains do you exceed the magical 50% threshold of finding that splash color by turn 4 on the play. But in doing so, you have decreased the chances of finding at least one of each of your main color sources down to 79%, a concerningly low percentage. If this is all there were to it, you could simply take a look at this graph and see which combination of percentages you were willing to deal with to splash your Elesh Norn. But luckily, there are ways to increase the total number of sources for each of our colors in our deck using our source examples from earlier. What if we were able to keep 9 red sources and 8 blue sources while still having 4 white sources for our splash with a mana base that looks something like this? 2 Tranquil Coves, 2 Wind-Scarred Crags, 7 mountains, and 6 islands gives us 9 total red sources, 8 total blue sources, and 4 total white sources because of our dual lands. How does this mana base change our percentages? You improve your odds of finding one of those 4 white sources by turn 4 on the play to a whopping 70%, while still remaining at an 87% chance of finding at least 1 red and 1 blue source as well. Ensuring that you have the proper number of sources for the proper number of splash cards is the key to building a good mana base. Now, the reason Magic the Gathering is the greatest game of all time is because there are endless possibilities when it comes to how to build a deck and build a mana base. So what happens if you're looking to splash 2 off-color bombs like Elesh Norn and, let's say, Gideon Martial Paragon? Well, the more white cards you intend to splash, the more sources you're going to need to have to keep your mana base performing at an optimal level. With just the Elesh Norn, here are the various chances you will draw that Elesh Norn without one of your white sources based on the number of white sources in your deck. Notice that with just 1 white source in your deck, there's a 19% chance you'll find that Elesh Norn but not have the mana to cast it, a concerningly high percentage. But if you're able to fit in 4 white sources into your mana base, that dips all the way down to 8%, a more reasonable number. But how does all of this change if we add the Gideon to our deck? Well, with just 1 source, in 1/3 of games you will mana screw yourself as you have a 33% chance to find either the Elesh Norn or the Gideon without finding your white source. Not until you reach 4 white sources will you improve your odds to over 30% to find a source and a splash card by turn 4 on the play. You can take a closer look at this table and previous tables to see what sorts of sources you might need to make you feel comfortable to splash a certain number of cards. Now, how many of you have ever tried to splash a double-pipped card like Lyra Dawnbringer and been told by content creators like myself or even some of your friends that you can't splash double-colored cards? Well, let's take a look as to why that is. With just 2 sources in your deck, there is a 6% chance that you will find both of those 2 sources by turn 4 on the play, and a 24% chance you will find Lyra but not have both of your 2 white sources. This is the perfect example of how mana screw manifests itself when building a mana base. You'll notice that not until you find a way to include 7 white sources will your odds of having 2 of those sources by turn 4 on the play be over 50%. It's not that it will never work out, but as you can see, just by looking at this table, the odds are greatly stacked against you. Now, as a final example, let's take everything we've learned into consideration when building a mana base for a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty deck that I drafted here on the channel way back in March of 2022. I'm choosing this really old example because I played all 5 colors in this draft and had to make all sorts of considerations when building my mana base, and it's a great example of how to put everything I've talked about in this video into practice. Before I show you the mana base that I came up with, I've gone ahead and pulled out every card in the deck that might be able to be counted as a source of mana and highlighted them for you here. Feel free to pause and take note of them. Now, on your screen, you can see every card in the deck that I would consider to be splashed, which is basically every card that isn't green, and I will also include every non-basic land that I drafted as options to include in the mana base as well. What I'd like you to do now is to hop into the description and export this list and then import it into sealeddeck.tech to mess around with it all yourself and see what you would come up with as far as a mana base, and then you can compare it to the final mana base that I came up with for this deck. Go ahead, you can do that right now. In a few seconds, I'll be spoiling my solution, so feel free to pause the video. As you can see in my solution, I decided to use every non-basic land available to me in the pool, as well as 1 mountain, swamp, and plains, 3 islands, and 5 forests. Obviously, this deck contains many more green cards than others, so I wanted to make sure I had enough green sources to be able to cast my green cards. This deck ended up with 15 green sources, 12 blue sources for 2 blue cards, one of which is double pipped, 12 white sources for 2 white cards, 10 red sources for 2 red cards, and 10 black sources for 2 black cards. A mana base I would be very happy to run and consider a good, consistent mana base. Did you come up with the same solution? Were you able to identify all of your sources and feel confident that you had enough for all of your cards you wanted to play? If not, drop me a comment down below and I'll see if I can clarify anything else for you. So, at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is how many sources you have in your deck to justify running any number of off-color cards. I've given you all sorts of data about how various numbers of sources affect your percentage chance to draw specific combinations of cards, but it's up to you to do with that information what you will. Some people might be more risk-averse than others and be willing to risk it with the lower percentages, but remember, if you're one of those people, you're not allowed to complain about getting mana screwed. Just kidding. Complain away. It's what we do.